Welcome back to ABA Chapter Chat.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to do a deep dive into aversive control,
Oh, fun.
which is, it can be a tricky concept in ABA,
You can.
but we're going to break it down so that it's clear and easy to apply in your practice.
Definitely.
So to kind of kick things off, think about this.
Okay.
Why do we hit the snooze button?
Mm-hmm.
Or avoid talking to that one coworker?
Right.
Or even file our taxes on time?
Yeah.
It all comes down to wanting to get away from something unpleasant.
That's exactly what aversive control is.
Right.
It's how the things that we want to avoid end up shaping how we behave.
I like it.
And there are two main branches that we talk about:
Okay.
punishment and negative reinforcement.
And we're going to unpack both of those today.
We are.
So let's start with the basics.
Okay.
What exactly are aversive stimuli?
Yeah.
And why are they so important for us to understand as ABA professionals?
Yeah. Aversive stimuli are essentially anything
Okay.
that an organism will try to escape or avoid.
Okay.
So a person or an animal. Mm-hmm. And some of those are innate, like a bee sting.
Right.
Our instinct is to avoid those because of the pain.
Yeah.
But then a lot of them are also learned through our experiences.
So, like, if you think about how a failing grade
Yes.
can become aversive for a student
Absolutely.
if they've, been punished for getting a bad grade in the past.
Right. They've learned that association.
Exactly.
And that's why it's so important to understand what's aversive
Yeah.
to each individual that we're working with, because something that might be aversive or unpleasant for one person
Right.
might not be for another.
Totally.
And that individualized understanding is crucial
Yeah.
for creating effective interventions.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to positive punishment.
Okay.
And I know the word punishment can sound kind of harsh.
Right.
So can you clarify what it actually means in the context of ABA?
For sure. So in ABA, punishment is not about being mean or intending to cause harm or anything like that.
Okay.
It simply means that something is presented immediately after a behavior,
Okay.
and that presentation causes a decrease in that behavior.
So if I reprimand a child for running into the street,
Mm-hmm.
it only counts as punishment if it actually makes them stop running into the street.
Exactly.
Cool.
It's all about the effect on the behavior and not necessarily our intent.
Got it.
And then for punishment to be effective,
Mm-hmm.
there are a few things that are really crucial:
Okay.
intensity, immediacy, and schedule.
Can you break those down for us?
Of course.
Awesome.
So intensity is how strong the punishment is.
Okay.
If it's too mild, it won't make much of a difference.
Right.
But if it's too intense, it could lead to some unwanted side effects,
Gotcha.
which we'll talk about a little bit later.
Okay.
Immediacy refers to the timing.
Mm-hmm.
The closer the punishment is to the behavior,
Right.
the more effective it's likely to be.
So you don't want to have a delayed punishment.
Yes.
Because then that could end up reinforcing the unwanted behavior.
Absolutely. So like if a student is reprimanded much later for talking out of turn,
Yeah.
they might just remember the fun they had disrupting the class.
And not even really remember what the reprimand was for.
Right.
Right. Okay. And then what about schedule?
So schedule refers to how often the punishment is delivered.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes a consistent schedule is best,
Okay.
but sometimes it's more effective to use a more intermittent approach.
This makes me think about overcorrection,
Yes,
which is a type of positive punishment that we use in ABA.
it is.
Can you give an example of that?
Absolutely. So imagine a child who trashes their room during a tantrum.
Mm-hmm.
With overcorrection, they wouldn't just have to clean up their mess.
Okay.
They might have to clean the entire house.
Wow.
The idea is that the extra effort involved
Right.
makes that aversive enough that
Mhm.
they're less likely to have another tantrum.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit now
Okay.
and talk about negative punishment.
Yeah.
So how is negative punishment different from positive punishment?
So with negative punishment, we're taking something desirable away
Mhm.
after a behavior to decrease its occurrence.
Okay, so we're removing a privilege.
Exactly.
Okay.
So something like timeout,
Hmm.
where a child is removed from a reinforcing environment for a specific amount of time.
Right, because the time and environment is more reinforcing than being in timeout.
Exactly.
Right.
And then another one is response cost,
Oh.
where a specific reinforcer is removed.
Okay.
So like if you get a speeding ticket,
Mm-hmm.
you lose money.
Yeah, that's definitely a powerful reinforcer for most people.
For most people.
Makes me think about token economies in the classroom,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
where a student might lose tokens
Uh-huh.
if they've misbehaved.
Exact, that they've earned for good behavior.
Right.
And our sources mentioned a study, actually,
Oh, cool.
where response cost was more effective than a DRO procedure
Wow.
at reducing disruptive behaviors in preschoolers.
That's a great example of how powerful it can be.
It is.
But I know that negative punishment often gets confused with negative reinforcement.
It does. They sound similar.
And I think that's where it can get really tricky for people.
Yeah, and it's really important to tease those two apart.
Right.
So with negative reinforcement, a behavior increases because it removes or prevents something aversive.
Yeah, okay.
So it's all about escaping or avoiding something unpleasant.
So it's like the difference between taking an aspirin when you already have a headache.
Yes.
That's escape.
Escape.
And studying to avoid getting a bad grade in the first place.
Avoidance. Perfect example.
Okay, I'm glad I got that right.
Yes.
So both of them are about getting away from something we don't like. But they work a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And there are some unique challenges
Definitely.
that come with avoidance interventions in particular.
There are, yeah. So if we get really good at avoiding something, we might have less contact with the negative consequence, which can actually weaken the motivation to keep avoiding it.
So, like, the fear factor diminishes because we never actually experience the negative outcome.
Exactly.
It's like the boy who cried wolf.
Yes.
You know, if the wolf never shows up, people stop believing the warnings.
Exactly. That's a great analogy.
I was pretty proud of that one.
Yeah.
But this makes me think about the anti-vaccine movement.
Okay.
Because vaccines have been so successful at preventing diseases.
Right.
A lot of people haven't had to experience how dangerous those illnesses actually can be.
Absolutely. So the success of the avoidance in that case can actually kind of undermine the perceived need for it.
Right.
Which is why understanding those nuances of avoidance and how our experiences shape our behavior is so important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I want to touch on that classic shuttle box experiment.
Oh, yeah.
Because I know this is a great way to visualize avoidance learning.
Yeah, definitely.
So can you explain that for our listeners?
Of course. So picture a box with two compartments separated by a barrier.
Okay.
An animal, let's say a rat, is placed in one of the compartments, and a warning signal, like a light, comes on, followed by a mild electric shock on the rat side of the box.
Okay.
To avoid that shock, the rat learns to jump over the barrier to the other side before the shock hits.
So they learn to associate the light with the impending shock.
Exactly.
And take action to avoid it.
Exactly.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and that actually leads into another distinction.
Okay.
Discriminated avoidance versus non-discriminated avoidance.
Okay.
So in the shuttle box, there's that clear warning signal.
The light.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
With non-discriminated avoidance, there's no specific cue.
So then the behavior is more about preventing a potential threat.
Yes.
That could happen at any time.
Exactly.
Like someone who compulsively washes their hands to avoid germs.
Perfect example. They aren't responding to a specific signal.
Right.
They're just trying to prevent a potential negative outcome.
Or constantly saving your work on the computer.
Yes.
Just in case it crashes.
Exactly.
That's a good one.
And this is where that avoidance paradox we talked about comes into play again.
Right.
The better we get at avoiding something, the less we experience the negative consequence.
Right.
Which can actually weaken that avoidance behavior over time.
It's like the student who only studies to avoid failing.
Yes.
But if they manage to pass without studying, then they might start slacking off.
Exactly.
Because they're not experiencing that negative consequence.
Right.
Okay, so understanding this paradox is key for creating and maintaining effective avoidance interventions.
It is, yes.
This has been a great overview of aversive control.
Yeah.
And we're not done yet, are we?
Not at all.
We also need to talk about the ethics surrounding aversive control.
Absolutely.
Especially when we're thinking about punishment.
Definitely. As ABA professionals, we always want to be putting the well-being of the individuals we work with first and foremost.
Of course.
So punishment should really only be considered when those other more positive evidence-based interventions haven't worked.
Right.
And the behavior is a serious risk.
So it's really a last resort.
Yes.
And even then, it should always be paired with reinforcement for appropriate behavior.
Absolutely. We want to be teaching and reinforcing the behaviors we want to see, not just focusing on decreasing the unwanted ones.
Right.
But even when we're implementing punishment correctly, there can be some unintended negative consequences.
Right. And our sources highlighted some important things to watch out for.
Yes.
Like the persistence of the punisher's behavior, learned helplessness, aggression, and social disruption.
Right. These are all things that we need to be very mindful of.
Those sound pretty serious. Can you break those down for us?
Of course. So let's start with the persistence of the punisher's behavior.
Okay.
So Because punishment can be really effective at reducing that unwanted behavior quickly,
Right.
the person who's delivering the punishment can become reliant on it.
So they might start using it more often.
Exactly.
Even in situations where it's not the best choice.
Yes, even when it might not be the most ethical choice.
Right.
So it creates this cycle where punishment becomes the go-to solution,
Yeah.
even when other approaches might be more effective and beneficial.
Interesting.
In the long run.
And then what about learned helplessness?
So learned helplessness, our sources talked about that study with the dogs.
Right, that was a tough one.
It was a very controversial study, but it showed how repeated exposure to these uncontrollable aversive events can lead to that sense of helplessness.
Right.
Even when escape or avoidance becomes possible.
So even when the dogs could get away from the shock,
right.
they just didn't.
They had learned to give up.
Yeah. That's pretty heartbreaking.
It is, and it applies to humans, too.
Right.
Think about situations where people are facing constant criticism or experiencing repeated failures no matter what they do.
It's like that feeling of nothing you do matters.
Right. It can be so demoralizing.
And that can really impact someone's self-esteem.
Absolutely.
Motivation.
It really highlights the importance of creating those environments that foster that sense of control and empower people to experience success.
Right. So it's not just about addressing the challenging behaviors. It's about building people up.
Yes.
And helping them to feel like they have some control over their lives. Okay, so we've talked about the persistence of punishment and learned helplessness.
Yes.
What about aggression?
Aggression.
I can see how punishment might lead to that.
Yes. Unfortunately, punishment can sometimes trigger aggression.
Okay.
And this can be in both the person being punished and the person who's delivering the punishment.
Right. Because it can be frustrating.
Yeah. It can be due to frustration, to pain, or a sense of injustice.
And I imagine that aggression can take a lot of different forms.
Absolutely. From physical violence to verbal outbursts.
Yeah.
To more passive-aggressive behaviors.
And we all react to things differently.
We do. That's a really important point.
So I imagine that some people might internalize that anger and others might lash out.
It is a complex issue.
It is.
And it makes me think about displaced aggression.
Okay.
Where somebody takes out their frustration on something that's not the actual source of that anger.
Right. Like if you have a bad day at work.
Yeah.
And then you come home and yell at your family. Your family wasn't the cause of the stress.
Right.
But they become the target.
Exactly. And that highlights the importance of teaching healthy coping mechanisms and helping people to understand and manage their emotions.
That's a good point.
So we don't want to create those situations where punishment is leading to more problems.
Exactly.
Right.
Okay. And then the last potential downside we're going to talk about is social disruption.
Social disruption. Yes.
And so this is when the person who's delivering the punishment or the setting where it occurs becomes aversive to the individual.
Right. So instead of learning from the experience, they start associating that person or place with something negative and try to avoid it.
So like if you think about a classroom
where
the teacher relies on punishment,
right,
then the students might start to feel anxious or avoidant or even become disruptive just to get away from that environment.
Exactly. It creates this negative cycle that can hinder learning and damage relationships.
That's a really important point.
It is. And all of these potential side effects really emphasize why we need to approach punishment cautiously, ethically, and always as a last resort.
Right. And why pairing it with positive reinforcement is so important.
It is.
We want to create environments that are supportive and encouraging.
Absolutely.
And focused on building skills and positive relationships.
Exactly.
Now I think we're ready to dive into another important concept. Coercion.
Okay.
And, it's closely linked to punishment.
It is.
But I think there's a little more to it than that.
Yeah, there's a subtle but really important distinction.
Oh,
so coercion, as defined by Dr. Murray Sidman, is about using punishment or even the threat of punishment to control behavior.
Interesting. So it's not just about the actual delivery of the aversive consequence.
Right.
It's about the fear of it.
It's the possibility that something unpleasant might happen.
And that influences our choices.
It does.
Okay. And what's interesting is how people often react to these coercive systems.
Yeah. And Sidman talked about the idea of dropping out.
Dropping out.
As a really common response.
That sounds pretty serious.
It can be.
So can you tell me more about that?
Sure. So imagine a student in a school where punishment is like the primary method of control.
Okay.
Lots of detentions, reprimands, constant criticism.
Right.
It creates this environment where learning becomes associated with all this negativity and fear.
Yeah, I can see how that would be so demoralizing.
Exactly. And for some students, the solution is to just kind of disengage.
Okay.
They stop trying, they avoid going to school, and eventually they might just drop out entirely.
So it's almost like a form of avoidance.
It is, yeah.
But on a much larger scale.
Right. They're not just avoiding a specific task or a consequence, they're avoiding that whole environment.
And our sources said that this dropping out phenomenon isn't limited to schools.
No, not at all. It can happen in families, workplaces,
Wow.
even on a societal level.
So then, as ABA professionals,
yes,
it sounds like we have a responsibility to be really mindful of how we're using aversive control.
Absolutely.
And advocate for systems that are supporting positive behavior change.
You got it. We need to be really careful about recognizing when our interventions are maybe veering into that coercive territory.
Right.
And champion things like positive reinforcement, skill building, and creating those environments that foster belonging and empowerment.
So it's about building people up.
Yes.
Not breaking them down.
Well said.
Thank you.
Knowledge is power.
It is.
And understanding these complexities of aversive control, both the good and the bad, allows us to make more informed and ethical decisions.
Absolutely. Well, this deep dive into aversive control has been so insightful.
It has.
What are some final takeaways you'd like our listeners to keep in mind?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, always prioritize those positive reinforcement strategies.
Yep.
Focus on teaching and reinforcing the behaviors you want to see. Remember that punishment, while sometimes necessary, should always be a last resort.
Right.
And implemented really ethically.
Okay.
Be mindful of those potential downsides, the learned helplessness, aggression, and above all, strive to create those environments that are safe, supportive, and empowering.
That's great advice. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into aversive control.
My pleasure.
It's been a great conversation.
It has.
And to our listeners, we hope you found this episode informative and helpful as you continue to navigate this really complex world of ABA.
It is complex, but fascinating.
It is. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time on ABA Chapter Chat.